Good afternoon. Welcome to the Weissman Art Museum's Roundtable on Transnational Adoption in conjunction with Megan Rye's exhibition, Foundling 100 Days. Before we start the program, introductions, we would like to start the program today with WHAM acknowledging that the University of Minnesota Twin Cities and the Weissman Art Museum is located within the traditional homelands of the Dakota people. It is important to acknowledge the peoples on whose land we live, learn, and work as we seek to improve and strengthen our relations with our tribal nations. We also acknowledge that the words are not enough. We aspire to honor and respect the Indigenous peoples, past, present, and future, by establishing meaningful, reciprocal relationships with Indigenous communities and by incorporating Indigenous knowledge into the work of the museum. We also acknowledge that this land acknowledgement is a first step in a long, complex process of reconciling with the colonial legacy of our institution. With this acknowledgement and our ongoing work, we state our commitment to this process. Good afternoon, good just afternoon, as I should say. I'm Diane Mullen. I'm the senior curator here at the Weissman, and I was the curator who was fortunate enough to be able to work with Megan Rye as she presents this version, this most recent version of Foundling 100 Days here at the Weissman Art Museum. Weissman always thanks, and particularly thanks in this case, the voters of Minnesota for supporting WHAM's operational budget through the Minnesota State Arts Board's Futures Funds and Wells Fargo Foundation Minnesota for also supporting our budget. Both of these generous donors allow us to bring free programs like this one to the public. Today's conversation is presented in conjunction with the exhibition Foundling 100 Days. The presentations and moderated discussion will explore historical, social, emotional, and legal perspectives on transnational adoption. The participants are leading thinkers on the topic: artist Megan Rye, immigration law expert Deepinder Mayell, critical adoption studies scholar Kim Park Nelson, and we'll be in conversation with the Carleton professor of sociology, Liz Raleigh. After the event, we would love to hear from you, the audience, during the question and answer period. Please put your questions directly into the Q&A box, which you see below us on your screens, and they will be moderated and given to our moderator to be able to ask them. We will be recording today's event, and it will be posted to the Weissman's YouTube channel soon. It is with great pleasure that we introduce our featured presenters. Megan Rye is a visual artist and teacher. She was born in Seoul, South Korea in 1975. Through paintings, drawings, photography, artist books, Rye explores themes of migration, citizenship, remembrance, war, and democracy. Rye graduated from RISD with a BFA in painting in 1994. She received her MFA in painting from the University of Minnesota in 2003. In 2005, she attended the Skowhegan School of Painting and Sculpture. Rye has received grants from the Minnesota State Arts Board, the Jerome McKnight, and Bush Foundations. Rye's current project is Foundlings, as we just discussed, portraits of international adoptees, including herself, and it's now on view in the Weissman's in the Weissman's Carlson Gallery. Foundling debuted at the Spencer Museum of Art in Kansas. It is on view now here at WHAM. Deepinder Mayell is executive director of the UMN Law School's James E. Binger Center for the New Americans, and director of the center's education and outreach program. Mayell works closely with center faculty, staff, and the law firms, and nonprofit partners to develop, implement, and resource the center's programs, including 4 immigration law clinics, community outreach activities. Before coming to the law school, Mayell was the director of the Refugee and Immigrant Program at the Advocates for Human Rights in Minneapolis. In that role, he directed the organization's legal services program and provided representation to asylum seekers at all levels of litigation. Mayell spent several years as a staff attorney with Merrimack Valley Legal Services in Massachusetts, where he represented victims of domestic violence and family, immigration, and housing proceedings. Kim Park Nelson is an educator and researcher whose work uses adoption as a lens to understand race and culture. Her work has significantly contributed to the field of adoption studies and Korean adoption studies in particular. Dr. Park Nelson's book, Invisible Asians, Korean American Adoptees, Asian American Experiences, and Racial Exceptionalism, published by Rutgers University Press, is based on her ethnographic research exploring the many identities of adult Korean adoptees. The work focuses on her cultural, social, historical, and political significance of almost 70 years of Korean adoption in the United States. She is an associate professor of ethnic studies at Winona State University, where she teaches comparative race and ethnic studies and Asian American studies. She holds a PhD in American Studies from the University of Minnesota. Liz Raleigh, Elizabeth Raleigh, Liz, is an associate professor of sociology at Carleton College. She finds meaning in connecting with students and teaching them about family formation and racial inequality. Teaching classes on the sociology of assisted reproduction and adoption and social research methods, Dr. Raleigh leverages her love of mixed methods research to introduce students to the latest scholarship in these areas. When not in the classroom, she strives to bring the same curiosity and conscientious work ethic to her role as the department chair. As a teacher and scholar and administrator, she looks for opportunities to deepen her own and others' understanding of social inequality and believes that sociology has a role to play in seeking social change. Dr. Raleigh holds a PhD in sociology from the University of Pennsylvania and is the author of the open access book, Selling Transracial Adoption, Families, Markets, and the Color Line. I now want to welcome our presenters, our panelists and presenters to the screen and hand over the reins to Liz. Thank you. Oh, I have one more thing to say. I forgot about, I have something I did want to tell you. At the end, all of you are given a survey for this event, and we'd be really happy and appreciative if you'd answer it. And now to you, Liz, sorry.
Great, thank you so much. And thank you, Diane, for that wonderful introduction. I just want to extend my thanks as well to the Weizmann Museum and to all of the organizers for putting this together. And of course, to my co-panelists who are fabulous. And so Deepinder Mayell, Kim Park Nelson, and Megan Rye, whose work inspires this all today. Before I get going, I do want to just take a moment too to thank the audience, people who have come to take time out of their day to engage with this. And so the hope and the idea is that for the first 50 minutes or so, I have some questions that we've prepared to spark conversation. But I want to echo that please be sure to put your comments into the Q&A, and so that way we can start to think about and to move towards those as well. And the other thing, I want to just take a moment to acknowledge everything that's going on in the world today. And then certainly, because as we think about what's going on in Ukraine, that the relationship, I think, between political violence and a pipeline that is created and sustained, not only for refugees, but also for transnational adoption. So in that regard, I think that, Megan's work is all the more timely and a really important thing to take a look back and to think about the legacies of adoption, particularly in Minnesota, as we grapple with the horrific events that are unfolding in the world right now. And so thank you for taking the time to be here and to engage in those conversations with us. And so what I'd like to do is, actually, before we get started fully, I know that in the opening slides, if you were here, that you may have had a chance to see the, and hopefully many people have gotten a chance to see the exhibit, but just in order to make sure that we are welcoming, that everybody starts off on the same page, I wanted to take a second and to just make sure that people had seen, and I think I'm sharing the right, actually, is this the wrong? Sorry, this is the beauty of the practice beforehand, and yet things do not always happen. Okay. I'm just checking to make sure, but what I can see, can you all see the screen? This is such a moment, okay. Oh, rookie mistake, even though I'm trying that, so people can actually get a chance to visualize. We'll be talking a lot about, of course, the significance of the target bag, to think about this series of work in these portraits. And so for people who haven't gotten a chance to see it, just so you know where You could find out more about the exhibit and, of course, about the Weissman's programs as well. All right, I will stop sharing now and move to our first question. And so, of course, Megan, the first question is for you. Tell us about the project and what was the impetus for the work?
Well, Foundling features 100 portraits of children adopted internationally from 9 different countries: South Korea, China, Romania, Russia, Guatemala, Paraguay, Ethiopia, Colombia, and India. This is the first time adoption has been the subject of a wide-scale painting exhibit. And equally important to the exhibit and to the portraits are a collection of stories from each adoptee or their family. It was essential to me that every adoptee or their family had an opportunity in the exhibit to tell their own story in their own words. This project has been faithfully championed right from the beginning by the Weissman, with Diane Mullen, Lyndall King, and now new WAM director, Alejandra Peña Gutierrez. You asked me previously if there's something unexpected about this project, and the unexpected element really is the target bags themselves, and I know we'll get to more of that.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. And so maybe this would be a good time too, I think, to welcome the 2 other panelists and voices. And so Kim, I'll start with you. How does Foundling 100 Days intersect with your own work and interests? In other words, what brings you here today?
Well, there's many kind of overlaps and intersections, I think, between the project that Megan is, the installation that Megan has done, and my own work. Like Megan, I'm also a Minnesota adoptee. I grew up here. And I recognize that here in the state of Minnesota, we have kind of a special relationship with Target. And so I definitely connect as a Minnesotan and as a Minnesota adoptee with that facet of the work. In my own research, I started my research looking at the lived experiences of Korean adoptees, of adult Korean adoptees, but have, as my work has progressed over the space of 20 years, I've started looking at adoptees from other countries as well. And then my most recent work and research on adoption is more focused on adoption representation, and including the kind of cultural production of adoptees. And so there are, like I said, there are many. It's like, in what way am I not kind of interested in the work that that Megan is doing? It's like I'm interested in every way, and there's a lot of connections with my own work. So, and I also appreciate the opportunity to be here today. And so thanks to the Weissman, and thanks to you, Liz, for involving me in this.
Great. Well, I'm glad that you're here. And then Deepinder, how about you? I wonder if you would talk a little bit about, what brings you to this work and how it intersects with your own professional life.
Sure, thank you. And thank you everyone for inviting me onto this panel. I'm really excited to have this conversation with everyone. So I'm the executive director of the Binger Center for New Americans, which is at the University of Minnesota Law School, which is just across the river from the Weissman. So kind of close in community in that sense. But the Binger Center is a clinical program that trains law students to really bring about change in the immigration system and the broken immigration system. We have 4 legal clinical programs where we are representing immigrants in various stages of the immigration system, including immigrants that are detained in county jails in Minnesota, immigrants that are seeking asylum in Minnesota, as well as appellate work at the circuit court and Supreme Court level across the country around a number of different issues that have been targeted for systemic reform. We also do community outreach and education to different communities throughout the state and in the Twin Cities region. So working with new immigrants a lot and working with the kind of challenge of the immigration system, and which is a massive system. It encompasses all sorts of sectors of the economy, as well as implicates different parts of our foreign policy, our internal policing system. It really is this large overlay or underlay of so many different parts of American society. Personally, my parents are immigrants from what is now, well, they're originally from what is now Pakistan. My father was born in what is now Pakistan and left when the country was partitioned in 1947. And the same thing for my mother's parents. And they came to India, and then from India, they immigrated to the United States in the early 1970s, where I was born. And I grew up in New York. We are Sikh immigrants, and it has been a journey, right? Like many immigrants, and it's got ups and downs, and all of the struggles of being, middle class and being in America and trying to survive without really knowing, where the safety net is and what's going to happen next. And so, personally, the identity and the story of immigrants and that whole kind of conversation is something I'm really invested in. So, thank you for having me again.
Great. Well, thank you. And, thank you to our panelists for, not only talking about what drives you intellectually and your passions for art and your work, but also thinking about your social location. And so one thing I didn't say in my introduction, but I feel like is important to bring to it as well, is to, share my own social location as an adult transnational adoptee from Korea as well. So just in case people in the audience were curious about what also drives me to this work besides, my love of sociology. Okay, so Megan, one of the things, and I know that we had this discussion in the backstory,
Right.
is that I wonder if you would talk a little bit about the target bags, because I have some questions afterwards for Kim and Deepinder, but I think that it's really important to hear from you as the creator about the origin of the target bag before we start to kind of project our own ideas onto them.
Well, artistic and symbolic reasons really drove me to the target bags. First of all, a little backstory. This isn't the first time I've painted on Target shopping bags. Years ago, my son and I arrived home. He really wanted to do some paintings. We were all out of paper. I said, no, we're not doing painting today. We're all out of paper. We'll do painting another day. He looked around the kitchen at these Target shopping bags that were laying around because we had just returned home from Target, and said, Mom, I want to paint the bullseye. So we got out some black and white paint, just like I'm using black and white paint now on these bags. And he did this whole series of paintings, and several more times over the life of our family. After my daughter came, we used the bags again. So this was already, the utility and the bags as a surface was already in my memory. And when I came to this project and this subject matter, typically painters use a blank white canvas or a blank white piece of paper. The blank white surface was not special or unique enough for these portraits. And so I started to think I really wanted to connect Minnesota adoption stories to some sort of icon or emblem or symbol of Minnesota. And these bags were in the back of my mind already. And then I realized that 70% of all the adoptees, this was not deliberate, but 70% of all the adoptees in this project are from South Korea. And looking at the Target bags, the innermost circle in the Target logo, to me, connected to the circle in the South Korean flag. So the bags, for a variety of reasons, were a good fit. And then when I started the portraits, the bags themselves and the surface were so compositionally rich. There are 3 different designs of the Target shopping bags I used. And in all of the portraits, I was able to really respond to that surface. So we have children's eyes peering out from within the concentric circles on one of the bag's designs. I was very deliberate in placing that circular logo over where the infant's heart would lie. I thought about the target as a chosen object, but there are so many interpretations to these bags, and so many interpretations have been brought to this project that I welcome that conversation.
Great. I mean, I think the one thing I can imagine, and this goes for any sort of scholar or someone who produces, that once something comes out to the audience, it becomes text or art, and for people to take and to interpret, to go with, even if that might not have been your original intent. And so again, thank you for engaging this conversation, and then also to everybody and the participants. And so I hope that this is some of the questions that you might have been thinking about as well. And so like, I'm glad that you mentioned this thing about Minnesota and Target. So the Target bag, of course, has lots to do with adoption. And so you mentioned the circle around the heart, but of course, there's the role of consumerism. When I walked through with the exhibit too with Kim, she was the one who brought up, I think, very brilliantly that we know from the literature, unfortunately, that Asian boys are particularly sort of, quote, targeted for bullying and racism. And so the way in which that plays out through adoption, and as well as just thinking about the role of colorism, and particularly in international and transnational placements or domestic, that the so-called paper bag test, that a child's skin had to be lighter than a paper bag. And so we can think about all of these different things to unpack here. And so maybe I'll start with you, Kim, if you just want to riff a little bit on what kind of resonates with you most, today, as we think about the role of the Target bag and how it intersects with your scholarship.
Thanks, Liz. Well, I think that it was great to walk through the exhibit with Liz, because we were sort of able to just like kind of, share our free associations as we were kind of standing in the middle of it. For me, I actually grew up in St. Paul. And so the Target that I shopped at is the so-called T1, like the first ever Target, which is in Roseville. And of course, it's like, I guess now people everywhere, but for my entire lifetime, everyone's just at Target all the time. It's like, you can't avoid Target. So to me, there's this really interesting kind of like overlap or overlay, because of Minnesota as like the home of Target and sort of the origination location of Target, which of course has now become like a huge international brand. But also that the state of Minnesota has the highest proportion of Korean adoption of any state in the country. And so, I don't think that those two things are in any way causally related, but it is something that's happening at the same place at the same time. And so as a younger person, I remember shopping in Target and seeing, they would have these sort of like photo murals on the wall, and seeing for the first time images of adoptive families in advertising. And I think that that's become like much more normalized now. But I think that because Target HQ is in Minnesota, in the Twin Cities, a lot of their employees are part of transnationally adopted families, just because there's also a high proportion of international adoption here in the state. And so I really see Target as sort of like, I don't know if I want to call it a pioneer, but they kind of took the family constellations that they were seeing in their own workforce, and they used that as the family formation for the advertising imagery. And so I always thought that was really interesting, for me as an adoptee and adoption scholar was located in the state of Minnesota. And then I also think that, the bag itself as being sort of like the packaging for something that you've just purchased, I also think that there's some significance in that as well. And I mean, and Liz, you know more about this than anybody, the adoption industry it does operate as an industry, and there's markets around it. And so I think that but of course, discussing adoption as a market, I think is seen by many people as very distasteful. And so, I do think that there's some kind of possibility for kind of thinking and discussion around the idea of kind of looking at adoption as a market and looking at these children as products, as they're kind of connected to this shopping bag. And so I guess those are sort of my first riffs, but I will stop there.
Well, that's great. And there's certainly a lot, I think, that we could say, but I want to make sure to get Deepinder into this conversation and for you to think about and tell us your thoughts about, the Target bag, or how, given your work, intersects in thinking about the role of immigration and refugees and migration in Target in Minnesota. What are your thoughts?
Well, I mean, just to put a little context on it, from the immigration law perspective first, when you think about when the immigration legal system looks at a population, they really look at immigrants in the United States in four big categories. The first category is family. Are you petitioning for someone who is a family member? And adoption falls kind of in that space. The other is, work-related employment-based visas, which is another way to get immigrant status in the U.S., which could lead to permanent status. And then there's also protection-based claims. So refugees, asylum seekers, victims of crimes, victims of trafficking, and this temporary protected status. This is a large group of immigrants, but that's kind of more in the kind of human rights space or bound by treaty obligations. And adoption kind of falls in that space somewhat as well, because processing is happening overseas with the Department of State, and you're kind of in this protection kind of category. Finally, you have temporary immigrants in the United States, students, tourists, etc. So from the immigration perspective, those are kind of the categories of how people come into the country. But the other perspective is the kind of populations that exist in the United States, right? So when someone is an immigrant and they come into the United States, they can come into a very different posture based on how they're entering. For example, there are people who have been living in the United States in mixed status families for decades. People in rural Minnesota, primarily from Mexico, who live in communities of with their family members and with relatives, and they're surrounded by their communities, but in kind of this mixed status, kind of quasi-status reality. There are asylum seekers who are being targeted because of their identity, and because of their identity, they are driving forward and bringing their family out of a place where a government is targeting them, right? So, and maybe they're coming into a community where they have people who have already escaped a regime or a dictatorship. But then there are also asylum seekers who are fleeing because of, let's say, their LGBTI status. And for those individuals, they're particularly isolated because sometimes it's their own communities that they are fleeing, or the mentality of their communities that they are fleeing because they line up with their persecutors as well. So it's a particularly isolating environment. So this relationship of the population in the United States and what's bringing you in here, it really grounds you in the United States and dictates a lot of how you will successfully kind of integrate into the United States. And when looking at the exhibit, I was really, those types of categories started to come to mind. And I thought of something that's really, that comes to mind about American freedoms, right? And a very unique type of American freedom. And that's through the immigration process. Migration is a very traumatic experience, right? And throughout history in the United States, it has often involved a very dangerous journey, a hostile environment upon arrival, and the abandonment of family at home, and a disconnection from that past. But also in that kind of trauma lies some of its virtue, right? There's that freedom to reinvent yourself, that freedom to put your pain and suffering and your old life behind you, to travel and start something new, to abandon the oppression, really, and suffering and all of its baggage and all of its history. And it's this liberation from all of that. But of course, the other overlay in the United States here is race, right? Because of race, you're often denied that freedom to forget, that freedom to reinvent, that freedom to escape, that freedom to really belong anew. Right? And this is certainly true for Black Americans who didn't see the ability to travel even in the United States until the Great Migration after the Civil War. And it just resonates with me because I saw those pictures and thought about all those children coming and facing something new. And what that thing that is new is American racism, right? And American racism is something that even when we have new clients who you get the victory and they get to stay in America, you must now learn about American racism, its prevalence, its unique hierarchies, its unique control, its unique power in this place. So those are some of the things that came to mind when I looked at the exhibit.
Great, thank you for sharing that. So Megan, I thought I would circle back to you then, and this idea of beyond maybe what you had initially envisioned, how, what are your thoughts about how these different interpretations get projected and then of course inspired by the work. And then also I'm wondering if Target has ever mentioned anything as well. Have you ever had any communications with them as a corporation about the exhibit?
Target has not officially commented on the project, and I don't expect them to.
Mhm.
It's interesting, I didn't realize this, but when I started to meet the adoptees in the project, 3 of them actually work at Target or have just left Target. So that's been interesting to hear their stories as well.
Great. And then how about just like as people think about, the way that which Foundling 100 Days can be read as an immigration story, and how things about American racism, about how all of those different aspects get literally, projected onto this conversation. What have been your thoughts? Is this a conversation you imagined sparking, and how have you been taking part in it since the exhibit?
Well, it's interesting because of the Target bags themselves. I realized that there would be some people that would immediately jump to maybe thinking I was making a commentary on the transactional nature of adoption. Obviously, I wasn't leading with that. But I think that this project very much rises to meet the moment, the political and the cultural moment that we're living in. I mean, if you think about when this project started, a couple years before the pandemic, since the pandemic, I think there's been something like 10,000 recorded incidences of anti-Asian hate crimes in the United States. When this project first debuted in 2019, we had a president and a movement whose attitudes towards immigrants and refugees were go back home. For decades, the adoption movement in this country and advocates have been advocating strenuously for legal protection for the 50,000 adoptees who are still brought here legally, but still do not have full citizenship. So I think all of these issues and questions are very much a part of the project. They're very much a part of the stories of the project. Definitely.
Okay. So that's a good segue in terms of thinking about my next question. And this sort of piggybacks a little bit on what you were saying, Deepinder, about different categories of immigrants. And of course, for those who might not be aware, but international adoptions and adoptees that are oftentimes processed, and you correct me if I'm wrong, you would be more the expert, in terms of this orphan visa. And so unlike the rest of the United States immigration, which is either labor or very much based on family reunification in terms of existing family, adoptees, particularly when they're babies, kind of live in this supposedly familyless world of being orphans. And so even if they are in some cases like in Ethiopia, there are actual relinquishment ceremonies that happen when parents travel. And so it's very clear that they have living parents who just by a number of really heartbreaking reasons don't have the resources to be able to take care of their children. And so relinquishment works out to be the life-saving only option. That of course, these are children who have families. And so what does it mean, thinking about adoptees as being the special category of orphan? And so also to think about what is the significance of capturing this vulnerability via the what is often called the referral photo, that first moment. And so one thing that got me thinking about this is that when I was touring the exhibit, 2 sort of older white women came in, and I mean, very understandably, one of the first reactions was like, well, look at those cute babies in the photos. I mean, you're a very, very talented artist, and so your ability to bring emotion and the life-like representation of these, cute photos, really comes through. But in the other way too, I think that there are some interesting implications about choosing to show, 100 baby photos about adoption. So I wonder if you would comment a little bit about those choices.
Yeah. The referral photograph is really the entry point to this project. And I have to back up a little bit by explaining how it came about. So my son was born in 2014. My daughter was born in 2016. Just by chance, I was paging through the family photo album a week after she was born, and I came across my own referral photographs. I had always known they were in the album. I had seen them before. My mother has talked to me about them, but in that moment, somehow, a week after my daughter's birth, those photos powerfully captured my attention and meant something to me. And Deepinder, to piggyback on something you said about the immigrant as having a chance for rebirth, but also about the trauma of displacement and loss, to me, I think that referral photograph epitomized loss. I thought about, in the short time I had known my daughter for a week, how much information I had about her, how much I knew her, how much physical items that we had already accumulated. I mean, before she was even born, I had all these ultrasound photographs of her from the hospital. We had the footprints and the measurements and the little caps and the blankets. We had like 1,000 photographs the first hour she was born. And I looked at these teeny little black and white photographs of me in the album, and I thought, this is all I have. These are the only objects, the only images I have from my birth country. And in that moment, I just thought there's a story to tell with these referral photos. The referral photos also are interesting objects in that they're how our parents met us. And sadly, if you think about, unlike the 1,000 photographs I already had from my daughter's first hour on this planet, there were no reason to take our photographs until that moment. No one would want the photographs. And so these were the only photographs that were taken of us in our home countries, and they were for this very specific person. As a mother, I also thought, unlike the million photographs we can now have of my daughter at 5 years old, she probably doesn't even have one photograph of me, and probably all of the adoptees in this project, that would be the case for most of us. I think it's also interesting that my children led me to this project. I was always the adoptee who was completely uninterested in my heritage. And so this project, I was led to this project by my children, which I think is also interesting. But those photographs very much speak to the moment we were perhaps found, but also it represents a lot of loss.
Yeah, I think that's a really poignant way. I thought maybe, Deepinder, I would circle back to you and thinking about, and you mentioned that a lot of your work, of course, is in training law students to think about this. I'm wondering, and maybe this is a little off script, and so if you don't know, don't worry, but I'm curious about how, if lawyers sort of come in, like I've had some conversations before with people who are like, oh, I want to do adoption as pro bono work because that's like the happy sort of type of law. And of course, then there are all these other discussions that we've been having about the way that, you know, American racism, trauma, the potential for reinvention. But I wonder about, as you think of from your work, what the role is for teaching, you know, future lawyers about this versus this, like, there are 3 categories of immigrant visas or something. Like, how do you go beyond that in your own work?
Yeah, I mean, that's a great question about how you go beyond with the law students who are, you know, who are like, and we have such phenomenal law students that are engaged, and, you know, for people who are interested in that, you know, it's a very significant clinical program, probably the most significant immigration legal clinical program in the country, training lawyers, certainly in size. You know, students are energized. Like, this is a part of the civil rights movement for them. They are, you know, there are lots and lots of students who are excited about it. So engaging them beyond the kind of appellate work and getting them deeper is a big part of our work. One of our clinics specifically takes teams of students out to rural Minnesota, where we are meeting with families who often have never met with an attorney, but may have been here for, you know, a decade or two, and seeing if there's any form of relief. Oftentimes there is not, because of the kind of you know, rough and cruelty of the immigration system. And you know, you mentioned it, Megan, about the thousands of adoptees who do not have citizenship. There are arbitrary and you know, seemingly nonsensical rules in the immigration system that create very unfair and unjust outcomes. You know, this is getting people in contact with some of those more deeper issues, and for me, seeing those baby pictures, going back to that really quickly for a second, it was just so vulnerable, right? The vulnerability of these children and how vulnerable a child is, and how, placing them not only just in a new country with a brand new family, with someone who doesn't know them, and taking, all the risks involved with them, but then at the foot of American racism, then at the, at the start of a potentially long and complicated immigration journey. It was a really striking moment of vulnerability, and wanting to kind of protect those children. That's the sense I got when I saw all those images.
Great, thank you. And so, Kim, I wonder, I think for two things. And so this question about, I'd love to hear from you as well as thinking about the referral photo and sort of the representation of adoptees as children. And then, Megan, as you talked about how your transition to parenthood was a real catalyzing moment. And so, Kim, I know you've done a lot of work with adult adoptees as they think through the life course. I wonder if you might also, contextualize some of that in terms of some of the ethnographic research that you've done as well, in terms of, from your work in your book, how the transition to parenthood has, shaped the way that some adoptees come to think about their biographies and narratives.
Yeah, so I guess to answer the last thing you asked first, in my conversations with adult adoptees, it is actually really common for adoptees to become more invested in their adoption story, and in, whatever, if they become like more interested in their heritage or their birth culture. It's really common for that to happen when kids come. Kind of the brief kind of description of like what happened to her, Megan, like I've heard that from many adoptees, where they say, oh, I was never really interested in my adoption. I'd never really had interest in doing kind of birth cultural exploration or any kind of birth family search, and then I had kids, and and I think that it makes a lot of sense, right? It's like, because you realize, I think that for so many of us who are adopted, and I think that goes back to kind of the huge significance of these referral photos. For so many of us, all we have is that picture, and then maybe some story, which I think that as time has gone on, like fewer and fewer adoptees actually believe the story that their parents are told about their life before they were adopted. And so even that story, I think for a lot of us is like, oh, I don't know if that's true or not. So, but the one thing that you have is this picture. And so, I think that's so many of us, and I think that most of our adoptive parents do not characterize our adoption experience as traumatic. Like they don't have that, they might have other traumas that they're sort of kind of attending to through their the whatever process that ended up in them making an adoption plan. But I think that for adoptees, and since most adoptees don't remember the time, or most international adoptees don't remember the time before we were adopted, you don't realize until you kind of start going through those parenting experiences yourself, like exactly as Megan was saying, there's a lot of stuff that can happen even in a very short time in an infant's life. And having that sort of relegated to like, oh, that happened before, and so it just kind of becomes a nothing in your in kind of your thinking as an adoptee, because you don't have that family memory of saying when you were born this happened, or your first words, or when you first started doing anything, like that stuff is sort of lost to our adoptive families oftentimes. And so yes, I mean, I do think that those referral photos can kind of carry a lot, we put a lot into them because because we have sort of nothing else. And so it's so interesting. So Liz, you had sent me this kind of comment about having overheard these two white women come through the gallery while we were in there. And I thought that was so interesting because number one, I didn't notice them at all. And number two, at no time when I was in that when I was in the middle of an installation, kind of like surrounded by all of it, that was my response, like, oh my God, these kids are so cute. And it's not because they're not. I mean, of course, it's like they're babies and
We
they're
are
baby
so cute,
babies.
right?
They're super cute. But for me, I mean, and I think this is maybe revealing about like my feelings of my own referral photos. I see so much trauma on the faces of those children, and I see trauma in my own face in my referral photo. And so, you know, I feel like I have a very different response to those pictures than maybe people who haven't been through the
Mhm.
that adoption experience. I don't even, it's almost like it's hard for me to see like the cute part, because what I see is like kind of the haunted eyes of children who probably
Mhm.
are not comfortable with the situation. So yeah, does that answer your question, Liz? I'm just
Yeah.
kind of all over the place there.
No, that's great. And this definitely reminds me when I think about this idea of so for those who are familiar, you know, Sarah Doro, that she wrote about this idea of in this book about Chinese transnational adoption, sort of disruption, and then of course this sort of reforging of bonds. And so there has to be like this dislocation that happens. And so the referral photo being part of that. The other part, of course, is that occasionally, you know, you see parents who are understandably just so thrilled to welcome a child that they've been waiting for a very long time, and they post, you know, the airport photo or something or whenever that they are meeting, and the parents, the pictures, this is sometimes on the cover of sometimes some well-known kind of memoirs written by people about adoption from adoptive parent perspectives, like exceedingly happy. And then of course the children, they look terrified. And so, I mean, to think about these different readings depending on people's social location is particularly important. And so this kind of actually, one thing I wanted to say, going back to the target one and just say a little bit more about, because Kim, you had mentioned it, sort of where my own work, you know, I'm really struck by the line on target bags, expect more, pay less. And so that part, I think, to see that throughout your series of portraits was so powerful, especially given, you know, that I had spent some time researching for a very different adoption system that is no longer really available to parents, that adoption workers were very much wanting to advertise that a real benefit of transnational adoption. And so thinking that so Megan, I think you have a few domestic adoptees. The majority though are transnational, or all of them. I'm sorry, I have to clarify.
I actually don't speak too much about the two that are domestic, simply
Right.
because the only reasons that they're in the project actually is because they themselves went on to adopt children from other countries. And so
Mhm.
it was an opportunity, obviously. The whole project, there are 13 families involved in this project who adopted children, multiple children. So they created families of non-biological siblings. And then there are two families where the adoptive moms were adopted themselves domestically and then adopted children. And so in all instances, the family members are hanging together in the gallery.
Oh, wow. Okay, well, that's great to know. Thank you for that insight. And so if all but two, so we've got 98 then who are international, transnational adoptees, that I think it is sort of telling in that sense about probably around a lot of the times that people were adopted, is that agencies really were kind of playing up the idea of the benefit to prospective adoptive parents of transnational adoption, is that these were mostly closed. And so that this idea that there would not be any other biological family, unlike now the way that domestic adoption, which are most pretty much always all open adoptions, meaning that there is the expectation, at least at the outset, of ongoing contact between the child and that child's first family, birth family. And so thinking about those things together, I mean, I think even the term foundling is so you know, poignant in this idea that somebody who, and going back of course to Deepinder about the orphan visa, that in the trauma, that there's just so little information that probably accompanies that until that they actually end up in the system in that very first picture. And that actually leads me to this question, because I think there's a lot to unpack about this description. And so if people want to see who are there, and you've got multiple windows open for the audience, I think I can do this right. I can send it to everyone. That's the the website that I had shared at the beginning in terms of thinking of the text that accompanies when you walk in. And so I want to go and unpack this last line because I think that there's a lot to talk about. For Rye's Foundling, the number speaks to the 100 days, speaks to the days of becoming, and also hints at the many stops on the long journey to the forever home. And so I wonder if you might talk a little bit about this, because adoption, there's this trope of the forever family. However, as we know that there is also, that's not true for everybody, and there is a lot of estrangement. And so I imagine that that word was very intentional on your part. So I was wondering if you might explain a little bit and elaborate about it.
Right. Well, as you know, forever home is a phrase that's widely used within the adoption community, but it is a complicated one. Obviously, when I was adopted, I don't remember that process because I was a baby, but I was a teenager when my cousin Glenn came from Romania. He came when he was 4, and because he was 4, he came with memories. He came with memories of being hungry, of being in a crib most of the time with other children with him. He remembers eating a lot of oatmeal, so much oatmeal that he never wants to eat any more oatmeal ever again. And my aunt and uncle, I think about them because I was able to have a privilege of hearing about his adoption, being a teenager. And I think that forever home to them was a commitment that the home that they were going to offer was going to be permanent, unwavering, unconditional. You know, they weren't offering a home that was provisional or temporary or however long it lasted for them. It was really a promise, but yet, as has been noted today, with that adoption, immigration comes disruption, challenges, reckoning, displacement. And so forever home to me is a promise given to a child, but it's only the first step. And when I said that the stories of the adoptees in this project are equally as important to this project, I think that the stories are really illuminating in this idea of a forever home, because I think that adoptees search for home and identity often over and over and over again. For example, Lee, another adoptee in this project, came around the same age as my cousin Glenn and would wail at the top of her lungs in Korean outside in the cold Minnesota winter for months after she came. I want to go to a faraway place. The airplane is coming. My grandfather's coming to take me home, because what else would she think but to be utterly confused by being plunked down in Minnesota in the winter at that age. Another student, Amy Wilcox, in this project talks about being so excited when she went to college because there are international students who were Korean, and she thought, you know, I'm going to be with my people. And she was disappointed, and she said, I imagine the Korean students were disappointed in me because we were all Korean, but not really. And I remembered, Amy, I just had a lovely dinner with some friends of the Weissman, the Kims. And the Kims are, I knew that I was going to be giving a tour of my exhibit to the Kims, this couple. And in my mind, before I got to the museum, I thought, you know, oh, the Kims are going to be Korean Americans, probably born in America. So I had a whole idea of who the Kims were. And then I get to the museum and they're speaking Korean, and, you know, and I realized, oh my word, I didn't realize they're real Koreans. And then I thought to myself, well, what does that make me, a fake Korean? And so, you know, there are all of these little moments as adoptees that you're always calculating, questioning, recalibrating, discovering. And another adoptee, Joey Fink, in this project, he said that whenever he enters a room, and I know we've all had this experience, you enter a room in Minnesota, it's completely Caucasian or almost all Caucasian people. And Joey said, I always scan the entire room for allies and exits. And what he meant by that is he was scanning the room to see if there were any other people of color in the room. He was scanning the room for exits. And to me, his comment about looking for allies and exits is, how can I be safe? And that safety, to me, is all about that sense of searching for security and home over and over again. So forever home, to me, is a very multi-layered phrase that is a promise, and yet then becomes this search.
Great, thank you. And so one of the things I know that we had talked about too is that, and thank you for the reminder about the stories, that because of course for COVID, like this book, that some people had written like multiple pages of their story that they wanted told along with the picture, but because you can't have an object that everybody touches, that it wasn't able to be included. And so there are some condensed versions that are playing through the screen as well. But when it's able to be the exhibit in the entirety as you had imagined it, that those pieces would really augment that. Kim, I wonder for you then, I mean, so much of your book really talks about this idea of home. Megan talked about this, the experience of adoptees going back to Korea, the differentiation between Korean nationals, first generation immigrants, and even the title of your book, right, about Korean adoptees and Asian American experiences. I wonder if you might respond to some of the things that Megan said, and as well as, share the parts that from your work that really kind of stand out as you think through this conversation.
Thanks,
Sorry,
Liz.
do you want me to rephrase? No, okay,
no,
sorry.
it's fine. Sorry, I don't want, even if I know I'm about to speak, it always takes me like a long time to find my own mute button. So sorry about that. Yeah, so I mean, there's like so much to respond to here. I mean, and I do think that the idea of home can be really complicated for adoptees, and I think that it changes over time. So much of our language about adoption, or when we talk about adoption, kind of reflects these biases towards kind of biological kinship. I think that probably every adoptee who knows that they're adopted alive has been asked probably many times, like, well, if you found your real family. And most of the adoptees I know will say, I was adopted by my real family. And then there has to be kind of a conversation about that. At the same time, I also think that this idea of the forever family, or the and kind of like the a celebration of one's adoption day is sort of like the real start of your life as an adoptee. Even though I think that all of that is really intended to embrace adoptees and to kind of be a counter narrative to this kind of second class child, second class family building idea that like an adoptive family isn't a real family. Even though I think that that's intended to kind of counteract some of those like negative messages about kind of the realness of adoptive kinship, I think that oftentimes that those same messages can really erase the identity of the adoptee and the idea that there was something before. And I think that that's why so many of us kind of contemplate that loss of what happened when we were adopted. And for many of us, that loss is complete because you may never find out. You may never find your biological family. You may never find, you may never meet anybody who you're biologically related to for your entire life. And so I think that idea of like forever home and like your real home and your real family is really, really complicated for adoptees. And I think that that's, adoptees, some adoptees have really intense relationships with their birth nation. Of course, there's many adoptees who go back and live in their, I'm kind of particularly thinking of Korea, but I can't imagine that other adoptees from other countries aren't doing this or won't do it as those kind of generations of adoptees get to the point where they're able to travel and live independently. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that everything we're talking about, it's like, there's a place that I think adoptees kind of hold in our culture, and especially here in Minnesota, that's complicated because the way that we're seen by those in our communities might be very different from the way that we see ourselves. And I guess like the other layer that I'm kind of wanting to add to this, and perhaps Deepinder has remarks about this as well. The other big paradox that I see happening in adoptee communities right now, and we've alluded to it a little bit, is that there is this population of adoptees who, because there's an immigration process involved for transnational adoption, who are without citizenship, and there are several adoptees, several dozen adoptees who've been deported to their birth nations. It's not a huge population of adoptees as far as I'm aware, though we have no official number of how many people are affected by that. And I think that also brings kind of like another dimension to the idea of like what's home, because of course for adoptees who are being faced with through deportation or who've been deported, the US government is telling them that their home is in a very different place than they kind of grown up knowing their home to be. And so I know that I've just added sort of like a whole nother layer to this conversation. And so I don't know if that's what you're looking for, Liz, but I just wanted to kind of give an additional thing for us to discuss if people are interested in going that direction.
That's great. I think my plan and thought was to turn the last question before we move to the Q&A over to Deepinder. Just in case you can hear, they're only drills, but there are some tornado sirens going off because I forgot that it's the first Wednesday of the month. I don't know if people can tell with my headphones, but if you hear them, they're only a drill, I promise. And so I'm sorry, I'll mute while people are talking afterwards. And so Deepinder, I wonder, one of the things I had initially wanted to ask is I feel like the symbolic work and the narrative, of course, and we've been talking about this, is so different, in thinking about refugees versus adoptees. And then, of course, this idea of, who is welcomed via citizenship. And even like which I think, as you bring up, Kim, it's so important to be able to to provide and to guarantee citizenship to transnational adoptees, but oftentimes too, the conversation, not that you are, but there are moments where it kind of stops there, that adoptees, of course, are the deserving immigrants, and then everybody else, like they have to get in line through this other process. And so I wonder if you would, Deepinder, give us your thoughts about that, and particularly in thinking about going back to the initial question about different narratives of immigrants between, refugees and adoptions, and maybe how the Citizenship Act fits in.
Sure. The immigration system, it's really this system that welcomes and brings people in, but the other side of the system is one that pushes people out, right? And that is constantly making the determination of who belongs and who does not belong, and is aggressively pushing that out, and has got all sorts of political, nativist, racial headwinds that push it back and forth. And that has been the history of the immigration system, highly xenophobic, but at the same time, there's this natural pull towards immigration, and then there's this historic pushback to it as well. It's an interesting juxtaposition, and someone who's an adoptee and the process they go through, and really the unfairness that they face if they haven't, acquired their adoption is not finalized by their 16th birthday, and they, cannot acquire citizenship. There's a real unfairness there in that moment that really is strikingly similar to the unfairness that is seen for refugee children coming, for example, on the southern border. The southern border migration flow of minors is probably one of the most significant human rights crises in our hemisphere, and has been going on for nearly a decade. The numbers are very high. Even during the COVID year of 2020, when numbers really sunk, there was about 31,000 apprehensions or encounters with children, unaccompanied children, at the southern border. And in the first 9 months of 2021, of the fiscal year at least, there was 93,000, right? And that's the way these numbers kind of go and have been going. And when those children come into the system and ask for safety in the United States, they're oftentimes released into the United States. Sometimes there are children, and the system divides people into three categories at the southern border. You're either unaccompanied minor, you are a minor traveling with a family, or you're an adult. If you're an adult, you will be held in detention likely. If you're a child traveling with a family or a child, oftentimes you're released into the United States and put into removal proceedings. Adults are often given ankle bracelets and must check in with ICE officers. But they must then have the burden of proving that they are eligible for asylum in front of court. There are no free attorneys, regardless of age. So a minor traveling by themselves will have to find an attorney on their own and pay them, figure out a way to pay them, and present their case in front of court. They face an extremely narrow and unforgiving definition of asylum that excludes the vast majority of people fleeing from Central America. So this system on the southern border for minors at the southern border is, and oftentimes people will come into the United States and now stay for years and years and years and years. But it's a long journey, but a forever home is not what's anticipated in this system for anybody. And if you deal with people in this system, it is very clear that the United States immigration system is bent towards eventually deporting this population.
Thank you for that really powerful reminder. I think that's really essentially important context too. I want to keep an eye and be cognizant of the time. There have been some questions that have come in. I think some of them I can maybe try to group together about the nature of the work. And so Megan, most of these are for you. I'm going to try to maybe say a couple of them and have you respond. So there was a question about, Vietnam and somebody wondering why I'm not included. But in others, two questions about someone who was hoping to clarify about the 2 domestic adoptees. So I think that those could be answered quickly. And then a larger question about, do you have any other plans to create other bodies of work dealing with adoption? And then someone saying, please say yes. And then for the rest of us too, if anybody knows if there are other professional artists who are also tackling these. And so Megan, I can start with you. Do you remember them? Sometimes it's bad to give 3 questions in a row.
Well, since this project occurred so organically, I started with my own referral photographs. I moved on to my cousins, children in the neighborhood who were adopted, people I knew. I realized that I wanted to paint 100 portraits to honor the concept of the 100th day celebration in a child's life in Korea, and connecting it to 100 portraits of children who have survived. So when I realized I wanted 100, I thought I have to, broaden my circle. And so I simply started asking those who I knew were adopted if they might share the news of this project within their adoption circle. So landing on the composition of the 9 countries of children who are adopted from those countries was completely random. It would have been lovely to include all countries, but these are the people that came to me. And it was incredible that so many, almost everyone who heard about the project said yes. I was actually amazed. I would have thought that an artist you had never met handing over your referral photograph and your life story. I mean, I would not have handed over my referral photograph or my life story to an artist who was going to paint them on Target bags. So it was incredible to have so many people, especially strangers, who in this moment thought this was an important topic and I want to be a part of it. The 2 domestic adoptions were simply included because those parents also adopted children in adulthood from a country internationally. So that's why those 2 families, they were included. What are my future plans? Well, I can kind of wrap this up. All of the paintings I only use 2 colors of paint in this project, black and white. And it was really driven by history. The earliest referral photographs were using black and white photography, which set a template for the entire project. The use of the color white allowed me to really focus, I thought, on the often dark hair and the dark eyes and the black hair of the people in the photographs. So it was a very deliberate choice. And also, to me, black and white symbolizes a sense of memorial. I mean, we're really memorializing a movement, an adoption movement that does no longer exist. The adoption numbers really peaked in the 1980s. South Korea has sent 200,000 children into the world, 130,000 of which landed up in Minnesota, and as has been noted today, the highest concentration in Minnesota. So this project is really, it is very much memorializing something that has passed. The numbers will never exist in the way that they have in the 1980s again. And so I think that what is going to be carried forward is going to be not this project replicated, or not like, oh, now I'm going to paint the children of the people in this project, but it's really going to come out of something will come out of this project. And one thing that has happened to me through the time that this has been up, which has been surprising to me, is I've been holding a series of small group meetings for the adoptees and their families on the weekends, for them to come and be in this space with myself and have a discussion and have their questions answered. And I thought that these small group meetings really were something that I needed to provide, should provide. It's a way of thanking and showing gratitude to all of the adoptees in this family and their families for making this happen. What I hadn't realized is that these small group meetings have definitely the feel of a social experiment. I mean, they've really become kind of the beating heart of the project. And by being together, by reflecting on adoption, by talking about things that most of us have never aired publicly, I keep hearing the comment over and over. Since I've been in this project, I've thought more about identity and race and racism than I ever have my entire life. People have told their stories. Now, they're coming back to add to their stories. Their stories are changing. The project definitely has a feeling of, you know, a lot of times an artist creates a statement, they put it up on the walls and it's finished. But this very much in these meetings has the feeling of something being created while we're together in this space. And so I'm not exactly sure how it's going to inform me, but it's profoundly affecting me and definitely giving me a path creatively forward.
Great. Thank you. Kim, I don't know, and this might be a little bit more adjacent to your area, but there was a question as well about other adoptee artists who might be doing work. I wonder if you might have some information on that, and if not, that's fine.
Yes, there are, and actually, there's kind of some of you might be familiar with the work of Diane Borchet-Lim. She's a Korean adoptee documentary filmmaker. She has 3 films on Korean adoption, and the most recent one has kind of been on the festival circuit for the last couple of years, but it's going to be airing on PBS on May 19th. The film is called Geographies of Kinship, and because it's going to be airing on PBS, it'll be very accessible for people. Even though there's sort of like a singular broadcast air date, I don't know if anybody really watches broadcast TV anymore. I think it'll also be streaming on PBS website for a month. And so it's a nice opportunity for people who might want to see that film. There are, so I mean, I think, that's the person I think of sort of most immediately with a current work to suggest to people. But there actually is this kind of interesting history of adoptee filmmakers and of adoption documentaries. Some of them can be kind of difficult to find, but others are pretty readily available on streaming services. And I feel like there's a big list there that I feel like I shouldn't kind of take up the time to give that whole list. But in terms of there's also this kind of like history of adoptee memoir that's a thing. So if people are interested in adoptee memoirs, in fact, like that memoir genre has really attracted people with adoption stories for a very, very long time. There's also, of course, a history of adoptive parent memoir. And so, all told, there's probably at least 25, 30 of these types of memoirs if folks are interested in that. Megan, maybe you know more about other visual artists or fine artists who are doing work. That's kind of that's not really an area of my expertise, but there always has been a lot of cultural production around adoption, and I think it's because people have such a lot to process, I think, and then also I think that there's a lot to reflect on within that experience. And I also think, Megan, it's so interesting that, you know, that you've kind of developed an adoption community around your work, and
Mhm.
the group that you're describing, and kind of what's going on in the group that you're describing, is something that I think that, you know, for those of us who have kind of specifically networked around our adoptee experiences, like I have been in many groups where people are kind of saying the same types of things that your
Mhm.
group is saying. And so I think I think that there's kind of, that's an interesting outcome of the work as well. And I actually wasn't aware of that. So thank you for sharing that with us.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you, Kim, for that. And it's interesting that you brought up Deanne's work, because there's another question that looked about if we've come across adoptees whose referral photos were ultimately not the same. And the person mentions that because has seen a lot of cases representing inter-country adoptees with citizenship issues that whose documentation doesn't match. And so, of course, that thinking about first person plural and that sort of switch of referral photos being part of that. I imagine, Deepinder, it's probably different for you in terms of what people, but people who are fleeing might just not have the correct or any documentation with them because they're moving so quickly. I wonder if there are things that you'd like to speak to about that question, or about missing documentation or things that don't match.
Sure. I mean, where this is coming up the most relevantly right now that I've seen is with Afghan refugees. You know, some 150,000 evacuated in August under horrible conditions. Survived getting here. You know, usually went through a military base overseas, and then were stationed in military bases here in the U.S. and now are being released into the into states, many in Minnesota, but limited amount of information and documentation. And sometimes you have families where a child has gotten onto the plane, but the parents have not. Everyone in the Afghan population has been given temporary parole for 3 years, after which there is no status. They will need to file for asylum unless there is some type of congressional reform or act change to provide them some immigration relief. As many people know, there's a lot of documentation needed for asylum. You need to prove that you're going to be targeted for persecution. Now, the Taliban is a horrific persecutor and has a great amount of documentation around that, but it gets a lot trickier, particularly if you're a minor child, proving that you're being targeted because maybe of your mother or your father's affiliation with a United States NGO or contractor, and you have no documentation about that. Or in all reality, your family's in extreme danger, living in hiding in most of the circumstances, and there will not be a reunification in most circumstances in reality. And so that's what comes to mind when I think about it, are these kind of groups and populations that can continually flow into the United States and have these really unique drivers, political, socioeconomic drivers that have brought them here, and how they find identity and community, and also struggle through the immigration system, but also find their place here. I mean, the whole country has been settled. It's a settler country, right? Settled by folks like that. So, yeah.
Well, I think that that's a really great way to circle in about this idea. What you were saying, Megan, is like the many different types of forever homes, and certainly how transnational adoptees occupy, in some ways, a rather, privilege isn't quite the right word, but sort of this exceptional, I suppose, to borrow some of your terminology, Kim, of thinking about immigration in particular, because unlike getting this sort of temporary parole, it's not like adoptive parents like, well, I had 3 years to decide if this was going to work out as a placement before. Of course, some people don't go and actually file for citizenship, at least those earlier cohorts. The law in 1999, I believe, changed that. So adoption did create and close that loophole. But certainly, as we think about the role of the forever home and versus other people who are submitting records for getting asylum who don't necessarily have that safeguard of knowing of permanency. And so thinking about that.
Right.
Speaking
Well,
of, oh, go ahead.
Well, in the 2000 Child Citizenship Act, which you just referenced, I mean, it did close that loophole, but it didn't close the loophole for the 50,000 that are still without citizenship. However, I mean, I think just a few weeks ago, the Adoptee Citizenship Act did pass and clear the House. And so there finally is hope that that situation will be addressed.
Yeah, thank you for that update. That's really important. There is a question here about, we've been talking about target bags, and so I want to loop this back in, that there's this ephemeral nature. I mean, it's recyclable content, right? That like, you know, and so in terms of the permanency, the question poser gives this point too, that there's this idea of the Korean adoption community is disappearing because there's not that, to borrow a sociological term about immigration, this replacement that's happening as younger cohorts sort of come through because there are fewer and fewer international adoptees. And so I said, like, the bags might not last that long. What are your thoughts about that, given all you've poured into this series of portraits?
Well, first of all, the fact that they're fragile, the fact that they're temporary, the fact that they're humble and recyclable and brown, all of those things to me were positive. Of course, from a museum, curatorial, and archivist perspective, those are all things that are nightmares. So the bags themselves are primed, and so they are protected. They probably will last way beyond my lifetime. But the fact that they are fragile objects, to me, has always been part of their appeal. It's part of their intimacy. They're tactile. You have a relationship to the bag and its small size. You know, people have said, you know, it's brought up the notion of shopping for babies, which to me wasn't how I lead with the project. It wasn't my intention to comment on that, but I have always thought instead that all curled up in a bundle, that is about the size of one of those bags. So that relationship to the size and its fragility has always been, to me, a part of that appeal of using the bags. Also, as I did say too, you know, we are commenting on a movement that will not exist in the numbers it once did. And I think personally that that's okay. I think we've learned a lot about adoption as the adoptees have come of age and are telling stories like this.
Okay, great. I'm keeping an eye on the time. And so I think that this is going to be the last question, and I'm going to try to find a way to phrase it so all three of the panelists can kind of take a minute or so to answer it. And so there's a question, somebody who wanted to share, thank you, you know, some of their own experiences about thinking about their own referral photos, and then a question about returning back to Korea. And so I think, Megan, for you, have you traveled to Korea? And, you know, if you'd like to comment on what your emotional experience was like. Actually, let me just say the other questions so people aren't taken by surprise, if that's okay, since this will be the last one. And then for Kim, I know that you've written quite a bit about the experiences of adoptees returning. And so I wonder if you might say a little bit, particularly more recently, about for those who are coming back, to comment a little bit more in general, given your work. And then for Deepinder, like this idea, as you mentioned, for refugees and migrants, the idea of returning back is often not feasible. And so for us to think about what that looks like in the context, particularly for refugees as well. All right, so Megan, I'll let you go first, please.
Well, first I want to say, because people have asked how I feel about my own adoption, I have always felt deeply, deeply, deeply wanted in my family and loved. And I think that the majority, all of the stories that I have personally heard from adoptees in this project, while they are wrestling with and rediscovering and grappling with many, many of adoption's complexities, this is a project composed of families who adoption is a creation of family and very much a symbol of love. Going back to Korea, I did visit Korea and had a very wonderful time there. I did want to say, though, that one adoptee in this project described to me, her story began with, I was raised surrounded by white. And she goes on to describe mashed potatoes and Swedish meatballs and all of the snow. and the search to find herself beyond being surrounded by white. And I think that for many of us in this project, that part of that journey is taking that trip back. I did not have very much to find because my story didn't contain a lot. I loved being in the country itself with all the strangeness that occurred by blending in, but also never feeling like I was a real Korean.
Great, thank you. And then for Kim, I wonder either if, I mean, you've got this great chapter about adoptees who live in Korea and like sort of this sort of longer term or maybe the short term people who visit. I wonder how you might like to contribute to the question that was posed by one of the attendees.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because, you know, and as Megan has just kind of identified, I think that for a lot of at least Korean adoptees, it's quite common for Korean adoptees to go back to Korea. And I think that this is going to be true. I mean, so for people who kind of don't know this history, the Korean adoptee population, Korean adoption has been ongoing for almost 70 years. And so we are right now like both the largest and kind of collectively the oldest group of transnational adoptees. You know, of course, there were people who came during World War II before most Korean adoptees, or really before any Korean adoptees came. But the big population, you know, and Megan talked about like over 100,000 Korean adoptees in the United States. I mean, it's a large number. And so I do think that it's become kind of normalized, like a return, or, you know, like we become what's phrased as return migrants. We go back to the countries where we came from. And it's interesting because, you know, when I've been there and when, you know, as I've talked to people who've made that trip, of course, there is some comparison to other types of return migrants. I think oftentimes Korean adoptees encounter other Kyopos, like Korean, you know, people of Korean ethnicity who are coming back from either the United States or other countries as well. And there is this, you know, for me, like I feel like a strange sense of home when I visit Korea, but also I know that most of the people in Korea don't think that I'm Korean because I don't speak the language and I have very American mannerisms. But they also don't think I'm American, which is also, I think, a pretty common way for me to be identified here. Like people don't necessarily think that they have no idea, right? Like I might be misidentified as almost anything. But I think that experience of misidentification is really common for adoptees because, you know, of course, like we are very, very fluent in our adoptive culture and language, but yet still have some connection to that other place. And so, yes, it's not a large number of people who are Korean adoptees who are living in Korea. There's definitely thousands more Korean adoptees living in the city of Minneapolis that are living in the city of Seoul, but it's a significant population because I think that symbolically, I think that it's very meaningful for people to kind of know that there's this population of adoptees that is kind of always cycling through their birth country.
Great, thank you. And so Deepinder, I'll give you the last word as we think about, you know, how to juxtapose, I think, return migration versus people who are probably very concerned about being returned, as you talked about, and how we might think about this in terms of the larger context as well.
I mean, yeah, it's a really big topic, right? I mean, the reality is there are more people in the world who are refugees now than there were, you know, at the end of World War II. And the population of people who are living with quasi status, right, with like not full citizenship in any country continues to grow. So you're seeing this kind of international trend. And there are refugee camps that have existed for generations now. There are people who are living on one side of a border where there's that's walled, like ours, you know, portions of our southern border, and they will never have status in that country for generations. So as these numbers grow, and you know, there's more kind of gray area, and then you have this kind of really reactionary walled culture coming up in countries, those numbers really put pressure on the nation state, right? You know, these places that promise socioeconomic rights, political rights, you know, all the basic rights are being denied to these growing populations. You can feel these populations are isolated, they're alone, but as they grow, they're going to grow in power and strength. And that transnational kind of solidarity and communication between those groups and identifying that this is a global trend, I think is going to be the trend that defines probably the next 50 years of you know, global migration, and then what happens in our nations and in our countries. That's how I would overlay all of that into this. That there's a big thing going on right now about status, and about who gets it and who doesn't, and the crazy hoops we're all jumping through to get it, and the unfairness of it. It's all leading to something.
I want to thank you and to thank everyone for all of your really just thoughtful comments. I want to highlight too that Kim put in the chat, people are interested in advocating for citizenship for transnational adoptees. There's Adoptees for Justice. She doesn't know I'm going to do this, but I've talked about her book a lot. I put the link to Rutgers University Press there as well, because it's a really fantastic piece of scholarship and it makes a huge contribution. And now I think I'd like to do is to turn it back over to Diane, who wants to just close up, and to thank, of course, the participants who have hung on and who are still here for coming. Thank you.
Thank you so much to Liz and to Kim and to Megan and to Deepinder for this very stimulating and very thoughtful discussion. We are so happy to have had you here. We could have gone on for longer, but we do have to close. I also, of course, want to thank all of the people who are participants, not just an audience, for their comments in the chat, their questions, and we hope that this conversation will continue outside of the Weissman and inside the Weissman, and we really appreciate everything. I want to remind you what I had said before, that there is a survey for your comments on the program. We really appreciate your feedback on comments on the programs. It helps us understand and be better at knowing what you are interested in, and also what kinds of needs you have. And so please, thank you so much. And there is a little carrot. One of you will win if you answer a $20 gift certificate to the WHAM shop, which we are happy to give to you, but we also are very, very, very happy to get your comments. It really does help us plan programs at the Weissman. And again, thank you to our panelists, our speakers. It's been an incredibly meaningful conversation. Thank you.